She was just my neighbor's aunt, but every time her smile lingered, it felt like a secret meant only for me. The first time I noticed her was nothing dramatic. No grand entrance, no sudden spark of music in the background, just a quiet evening when my neighbor had invited me over for coffee. I didn't know her aunt was in town then. She was leaning casually against the balcony railing, a cup of tea warming her hands. The evening sun touched her face in soft gold, and there was a patience in the way she stood there, as though she had all the time in the world. My neighbor introduced us, and her aunt smiled, slowly, warmly, the kind of smile that didn't rush past you but stayed, like a gentle hand resting on your shoulder. From that moment, I couldn't quite shake the impression she left. She looked at people as though she truly saw them, and in a world where conversations often skim the surface, that kind of attention felt disarming. Over the next few weeks, I found myself visiting my neighbor more often than usual. Sometimes it was for coffee, sometimes just to drop something off, but I always hoped to catch a glimpse of her aunt. She had this way of filling even ordinary spaces with quiet grace. She would sit cross-legged on the couch, reading, or hum softly to herself while arranging fruit in a bowl. Every movement was unhurried, purposeful, like she knew how to savor life in a way I was only just learning. One evening, the three of us sat around the table, and I noticed her listening more than she spoke. But when she did speak, her words had weight. She asked me about my work, not in the polite, passing way most adults did, but with genuine interest, questions that lingered, that made me think harder about what I really wanted out of life. Later that night, when my neighbor had gone to take a call, I was left in the kitchen with her aunt. She reached past me for a glass, her hand brushing against mine on the counter. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but the warmth of it stayed. She caught my eye and gave a small, almost guilty smile. "You're kind," she said softly. "And you remind me of a time when I still believed kindness was rare." I didn't know how to respond, but my chest tightened at the vulnerability in her voice. For all her confidence, there was something fragile behind her words, something she let slip only for a moment before retreating into composure again. When I left that night, she walked me to the door. It was a simple gesture, but when she wished me good night, her hand lingered briefly on my arm. Not long, not obvious, just long enough for me to feel the unspoken question in it. And as I stepped into the cool night air, I realized this was no longer just about a neighbor's aunt. This was about the quiet pull of connection, one that felt as natural as breathing, yet as forbidden as I kept telling myself that I was only visiting my neighbor, but the truth became harder to deny with each passing week. The anticipation wasn't for coffee or small talk anymore. It was for her. The quiet presence that always drew me in, no matter how carefully I tried to look away. One Saturday afternoon, my neighbor had asked me to help carry some things up from the garage. When I stepped inside afterward, I found her aunt sitting at the dining table alone, sketching in a notebook. She looked up, surprised, then smiled in that way of hers, soft, slow, like it was meant just for me. "You draw?" I asked, walking closer. She hesitated, then tilted the book so I could see. The page was filled with delicate lines, a vase of flowers rendered with remarkable care. "It's nothing," she said quietly. "Just a habit to calm my thoughts." I sat down across from her. "It doesn't look like nothing." She laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're kind again. Always kinder than I expect." The room was quiet except for the faint sound of traffic outside. I found myself studying the way she held her pencil, the gentle curve of her fingers, the faint crease between her brows when she was focused. When she looked up, our eyes met, and I couldn't disguise the way my breath caught. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "I feel like you notice too much." I lowered my gaze, suddenly aware of how close I was sitting. "Maybe I just can't help it." She set the pencil down and leaned back, her expression thoughtful, conflicted. "You shouldn't look at me like that." Her words should have stung, but they didn't. Because though she said I shouldn't, she didn't move away. And her eyes, steady, searching, betrayed the same pull I felt. Before I could speak, my neighbor's voice rang from the hallway, breaking the fragile silence. She quickly closed the notebook and shifted in her seat, as though nothing had passed between us. But I knew better. That evening, after dinner, the house grew lively with conversation. My neighbor chatted endlessly, the room filled with laughter, but my attention drifted toward the quiet figure across the table. She didn't say much, but when she did, her words found me, threading between the noise as though they were meant for me alone. Later, as people began clearing dishes, I found myself next to her at the sink again. She handed me a glass, her fingers brushing mine, and this time neither of us pulled away right away. The warmth of her touch sent a rush through me, an unspoken admission we both felt but couldn't voice. "You make it hard to forget you," she whispered, so quietly I almost wondered if I had imagined it. Her hand slipped from mine just as the others entered the kitchen, her composure returning in an instant. But the words lingered, echoing louder than the clatter of dishes or the laughter around us. That night, walking home under the dim glow of the streetlights, I realized the line we had both been pretending not to see was becoming impossible to ignore. Secret I wasn't sure I should keep. A few days passed before I saw her again. My neighbor had invited me over for a small gathering, just a few friends, nothing unusual. But I felt the pull before I even knocked on the door. Part of me hoped her aunt wouldn't be there. It would be easier. Yet the stronger part of me wished for nothing more than to see her smile again. When I walked in, she was already there, helping set out food on the table. She wore something simple, a soft cardigan draped over her shoulders, but it suited her, effortless as always. She glanced up, and our eyes met for just a second before she returned to arranging plates. That smile of hers appeared, restrained, almost cautious this time. The evening passed in a blur of voices and laughter. I joined in, talked, smiled, but every so often I caught her looking at me, and each glance was heavy with everything we hadn't said. As the night drew on, the others settled into conversation in the living room. I excused myself for a breath of air and stepped onto the balcony. The city lights stretched out in the distance, and the cool breeze steadied me. I thought I was alone until the sliding door opened behind me. She stepped out quietly, holding a glass of water. For a moment, she just stood beside me, gazing at the lights. Then, softly, she said, "You've been avoiding me." I swallowed, my hands tightening on the railing. I thought maybe it was the right thing to do. And was it? Her voice was calm, but there was a fragility beneath it. I turned to look at her. The way the light from inside brushed against her face made her seem both strong and vulnerable all at once. "No," I admitted. "It just made me realize how much I miss, even the smallest moments with you." Her lips parted, as though she wanted to speak, but hesitation held her back. Finally, she whispered, "This shouldn't be happening." "I know," I said, "but it is." A silence settled between us, thick with everything we feared and everything we wanted. Then, almost without thinking, I reached out, slowly, carefully, and let my hand brush against hers on the railing. She didn't move away. Her fingers trembled, but they curled around mine, hesitant yet unwilling to let go. She closed her eyes for a moment, as though steadying herself. "You're too young to carry this weight," she murmured. "Maybe," I said quietly, "but I'm old enough to know what I feel." Her breath caught, and when she looked at me again, her eyes were shining, not with tears, but with the raw honesty she usually kept hidden. "You make me feel seen in a way I haven't in years," she admitted. "And that terrifies me." I squeezed her hand gently. "It terrifies me too." The city noise below filled the pause that followed. She leaned just slightly toward me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence itself became its own confession. When voices stirred inside, she reluctantly slipped her hand from mine. But before she stepped back in, she turned to me with a softer smile, one that seemed both braver and more tender than before. "Promise me," she said quietly, "that no matter what happens, you won't stop visiting." I nodded, my heart steady now. "I promise." And as she walked back inside, I realized the resolution wasn't in grand gestures or declarations. It was in the quiet commitment we had made, to keep showing up, to keep letting the small moments matter. Because sometimes, the strongest kind of love isn't shouted. It's simply chosen, again and again, in the quiet spaces between words. The weeks after that night on the balcony felt different, though nothing had been spoken openly. My visits continued, casual on the surface, yet beneath every conversation there was a thread of something unspoken, something fragile but undeniably present. One Sunday afternoon, my neighbor invited me to join them on a short drive to the countryside. She wanted company for errands, and her aunt offered to ride along. I hesitated at first, worried about what time together outside of the familiar walls might stir. But when I saw her waiting by the car, a light scarf wrapped loosely around her shoulders, I knew I couldn't say no. The drive was filled with easy chatter. My neighbor talked most of the way, but I noticed her aunt gazing out of the window, lost in thought as the fields stretched endlessly under the late summer sun. Occasionally, she would turn and smile at something I said, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than it should have. When we stopped at a roadside cafe, my neighbor went inside to buy drinks, leaving the two of us outside on a wooden bench. The air smelled of wildflowers and warm earth. She rested her hands in her lap, her posture relaxed yet alert, as though she was both present and somewhere far away. "It's peaceful here," I said quietly. She nodded. Peace can be unsettling when you're not used to it. I studied her profile, the graceful curve of her expression. "Do you miss the noise?" A faint smile touched her lips. "Sometimes. But lately, I think I miss being truly heard more than I miss the noise." Her words sank deep into me. I didn't want to push, but I felt the need to answer honestly. "You are heard. At least by me." She turned to me then, her eyes holding mine longer than usual. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with understanding, the kind that didn't need to be broken. Before I could say more, my neighbor returned with the drinks, the spell dissolving as quickly as it had formed. Yet as we climbed back into the car, her hand brushed lightly against mine, just for a moment, as if to say thank you without words. That evening, when I walked her to the door after dropping them off, she lingered. My neighbor had already gone inside, leaving us alone on the porch. The porch light cast a soft glow between us. "Today was nice," she said, her voice softer than usual. "It's been a long time since I felt at ease like that." I nodded, my throat tight. "I'm glad I could be there." She hesitated, then reached up, smoothing a wrinkle in my shirt sleeve, such a small, ordinary gesture, yet it made my chest ache with tenderness. Her fingers lingered, then slowly withdrew. "Good night," she whispered, her smile carrying both warmth and restraint. As I walked away, I realized that what was growing between us wasn't built on declarations or grand moments. It was woven through these quiet, almost invisible threads, small touches, shared silences, glances that lasted too long. And somehow, those were stronger than anything else. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the streets with fading leaves and cool winds. My visits to my neighbor's home had become a rhythm in my life, each one a mixture of ordinary conversation and the unspoken current I shared with her aunt. The world around us went on unchanged, but for me, every moment with her carried a quiet significance I couldn't put into words. One late afternoon, I stopped by to return a book I had borrowed. My neighbor wasn't home, but her aunt answered the door. She looked surprised to see me, though the surprise quickly softened into that familiar, steady smile. "Come in," she said gently. "It's only me today." The house felt different in its stillness. Without the usual chatter, every sound was amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the kettle she set on the stove. She poured tea for both of us, and we sat across from each other at the kitchen table. For a while, we spoke of simple things, the weather, her latest sketches, the book I was returning. But underneath, something heavier lingered, pressing on both of us. She seemed aware of it too, her fingers tracing absent circles on the rim of her cup. Finally, she set it down and looked at me. "We can't keep pretending this doesn't matter." Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the storm beneath. I swallowed hard. "I know, but I don't want to pretend. Not anymore." She exhaled, her shoulders softening as though she had carried those words herself for too long. "You make me feel alive in ways I thought I'd outgrown. And yet, every time I let myself feel it, I hear the voice in my head reminding me of the years between us, of how this looks to everyone else." I leaned forward, my voice low but firm. "I don't care how it looks. What matters is what it is, this connection, this closeness. I don't want to lose that." Her gaze held mine, and I saw the conflict warring inside her. But then, slowly, she reached across the table, her hand trembling as it found mine. The warmth of her touch was steadying, grounding. "We can't promise the world," she whispered, "but maybe we don't have to. Maybe it's enough to just choose this, even quietly, even if no one else understands." I turned my hand to hold hers fully, the weight of her words sinking into me. then I'll choose it. Every time. A silence followed, not heavy this time, but light, like a burden lifted. She smiled, not with restraint, but openly, as though she had finally allowed herself to stop holding back. That evening, when I left, she walked me to the door as always. But this time, instead of only touching my arm, she leaned in and pressed the faintest kiss against my cheek. It was gentle, fleeting, but it carried all the truth we had finally admitted. As I stepped out into the cool autumn air, I realized that love doesn't always need grand declarations. Sometimes, it lives in the smallest gestures, smiles that linger, hands that tremble yet hold, and promises spoken not with certainty, but with courage. And for us, that was enough. Winter settled in slowly, draping the neighborhood in muted grays and the kind of stillness that made even familiar streets feel new. My visits continued, not every day, not too frequent, but steady enough that they became part of both our routines. Each time I knocked, I never knew if it would be a simple hello or another quiet moment that would stay with me long after I left. One late afternoon, I arrived to find her alone again. The house was dim except for the golden glow of a lamp beside the couch. She was sitting there with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a notebook balanced on her knees. She looked tired, though not in a way that invited pity, more like someone carrying too many thoughts. "Long day," I asked gently, setting my coat aside. She gave a faint laugh. "Long month." Then she closed the notebook, placing it on the coffee table. "I didn't expect company, but I'm glad you came." I sat beside her, not too close at first, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of the blanket brushing my arm. The silence was easy at first, but I sensed she had something pressing on her mind. After a moment, she said softly, "Do you ever wonder if you're making a mistake, even when it feels right?" The question lingered in the air. I turned to face her, searching her expression. "All the time. But I think, sometimes the mistake would be walking away." Her lips curved in a small, thoughtful smile. "You always make things sound simpler than they are." I shook my head. "No. You make things complicated, because you matter." Her eyes softened, and she shifted slightly closer, the blanket slipping so that it brushed against both of us. I could feel the warmth of her shoulder against mine now, unspoken but deliberate. "People talk about age like it decides everything," she murmured. "What we should want, who we should be with. But when I sit here with you, I don't feel the years. I just feel seen and safe." I let her words settle before replying. "That's all I ever want, for you to feel safe with me." She leaned her head against my shoulder then, slowly, as if testing whether she belonged there. The weight of it was light, but the meaning heavy enough to still my breath. I stayed still, letting her rest, feeling the warmth of her hair against my cheek. For a long while, we didn't speak. The quiet was enough, the kind of silence that felt like trust, like the beginning of something real. Eventually, she whispered, "Thank you for not looking away." I turned my head slightly, my voice low. I couldn't, even if I tried. She smiled against my shoulder, and I felt the tension in her body ease. In that simple closeness, we weren't worried about explanations or what the world might think. It was just us, wrapped in quiet understanding, learning that sometimes love doesn't need permission. It only needs two people willing to keep showing up. It was bound to happen eventually. The world outside our silences and small touches had always been there, waiting to intrude. It came one evening when my neighbor returned earlier than expected. I was in the living room, sitting close beside her aunt as we looked over some sketches she had been working on. Our shoulders brushed, and though nothing outwardly daring was happening, the closeness would have been obvious to anyone paying attention. The front door opened, and my neighbor's cheerful voice filled the hall. She stepped in, pausing just long enough to take in the scene. The distance between us too narrow, the warmth in our expressions too clear. Her smile faltered. "Oh, you're here again." There was nothing hostile in her tone, just a hint of confusion laced with something protective. Her aunt straightened, smoothing the paper on the table as if tidying her own emotions. "I asked him to stay for tea," she said evenly. It was nothing more, but even I heard the quiet strain in her voice. My neighbor studied us for a moment longer, her brow furrowed, before setting her bag down. The air felt heavy with unsaid words. Later, when my neighbor excused herself to the kitchen, her aunt sighed and leaned back, pressing a hand to her temple. "Do you see?" she whispered. "This is what I was afraid of. The questions, the looks. I hesitated before answering. Maybe questions aren't the worst thing. Maybe it's worse to keep hiding. She turned to me then, her eyes filled with both fear and longing. You don't understand what it means for me. I've lived long enough to know how people judge. And they won't just judge me, they'll judge you too. I leaned closer, lowering my voice. Then let them. Because what we share is real. And I'd rather face the world's judgment than lose this. Her expression softened, but her shoulders remained tense, caught between the pull of her heart and the weight of her fear. The moment was interrupted when my neighbor returned with tea. The three of us sat together, conversation strained but polite. I answered questions, laughed when expected, but beneath the surface, I felt the quiet battle waging beside me. The way her aunt's hand trembled slightly when she lifted her cup. The way her glances at me carried both apology and longing. When the evening ended and I rose to leave, my neighbor gave me a curious, almost suspicious smile. Her aunt walked me to the door as always, but this time, her composure cracked. She touched my arm, her fingers pressing just a little harder than usual. "Promise me," she whispered urgently, "that you won't stop believing in this, even if I falter." I met her eyes, steady and certain. "I promise. You don't have to carry the courage alone." Her lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. Instead, she gave a small, almost broken smile before stepping back inside. That night, as I walked home under the winter sky, I knew the world had finally noticed what we had. And though it frightened her, I felt something else, something stronger. A resolve. Because love wasn't just about lingering glances and gentle touches. Sometimes, it was about standing steady when the world began to look too closely.